Hello and welcome to Console Classics 101. In this installment, I'm taking a look at the Super Nintendo and its Japanese counterpart, the Super Famicom. The Super Famicom was released in Japan in late 1990, and the Super Nintendo was released in North America about a year later. The Super Nintendo was one of the major players of the 16-bit generation and is fondly remembered by an entire generation of gamers and is considered to be one of the best consoles of all time. The Super Nintendo was the successor to the original Nintendo, the Famicom as it was known in Japan. The original Famicom had the official name in Japan as the Family Computer. Over time, it sort of unofficially became known as the Famicom, as Japanese loved to short-form words. Eventually, when the adoption of the new 16-bit generation, Nintendo calling their new system the Super Famicom sort of officially indoctrinated the word Famicom into the official Nintendo lexicon as a word of what the system would be called. So what you got here is essentially the Super Family Computer, but is otherwise known as the Super Famicom. The Super Nintendo, on the other hand, is just pretty much the name, the Nintendo Entertainment System, just with Super in front of it. Pretty much just the North American equivalent of the Japanese name. The systems, when you look at them, you'll notice that they look quite different from each other. That is because in North America, and particularly America, of the early 90s, it was of the popular belief that something that was bigger, boxier, would be better than something that was sleeker or smaller. This was really just the prevailing opinion of design philosophy at the time, and as a result, the Super Nintendo was sort of painstakingly redesigned exclusively for the North American market. Although it's interesting because in Europe, the European Super Nintendo uses the exact same hardware shell design as the Super Famicom. It's only in North America that you get this sort of boxy look. A lot of people nowadays don't like the boxy look of the Super Nintendo. They think that it's ugly in comparison to the sleek, well-designed Japanese version. But again, it was designed specifically that reason to appeal to American marketers, or American buyers. It was, a marketing decision at the time. Otherwise, the systems are completely identical. They run the exact same hardware. They're both NTSC, except for the European one, which of course is PAL. And otherwise, just the externals are different. And it doesn't just apply to the consoles themselves. The game cartridges are also shaped physically different. So here's two different games here. Here's Final Fantasy V and Tetris Attack, which is Panel de Pon. These are two different cartridge designs. One is of the North American design, and the other one is of the Japanese design. What you see here is, although they look pretty similar, they're actually meant to be region locked. This means that the consoles will not play each other's games. That is because of these dips and the way the cartridges are physically shaped. Again, the Super Nintendo cartridge is very boxy, where the Japanese version has this sort of a curve to the edges. It also has these slits inside of it, which correspond to these guide pins that are in the North American version, but are missing in the Japanese version. As such, you can't physically fit a North American cartridge into a Super Famicom, and you can't normally fit a Japanese Super Famicom game into the North American Famicom. Or Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo, I should say. But there's a simple mod that you can do. The Super Nintendo has these two little slits. All you need to do is just get a pair of pliers, and you can go into the cartridge board. You don't even need to take it apart of a North American Super Nintendo and take out the two little guiding pins. The only thing that they do is prevent Japanese games from working. So once modded, you can fit the Japanese games no problem into a Super Famicom, or into a North American Super Nintendo. However, if you want to play North American games on a Super Famicom, you notice that, well, the cartridge bay here is physically smaller than the cartridge themselves. So unless you want to hack up the way the system looks and make it, look ugly that way, in my opinion, that's not a great solution. For that, you might want to pick up one of these things here. This is actually a Korean-made Super Nintendo to Super Famicom adapter. Simply plug this into the system, and then plug in your North American game, and it will fit just no problem. And that's how you play it. However, these adapters are not very common, especially not in the Western world. Again, like this one I bought from a guy who was living in South Korea, so that just shows you how uncommon they are. Prices range drastically for these things. I've seen them go for $50. I've seen 60, 70, 80. They're all over the place. So if you can pick up one for any price, you're pretty much count your lucky stars. Also, the differences in the systems. When the system came to North America, Nintendo decided to use subdued colors as opposed to the bright, sort of vibrant colors of the Super Famicom in Japan. In Japan, this was the Super Famicom controller. As you can notice, it is very similar to the Super Nintendo controller, if you've ever seen one. It has the 4 face buttons that are all distinctly colored. And you actually notice, if you look at the Super Famicom hardware itself, you'll see this symbol here. This symbol is the Super Famicom symbol that was used in Japan. In North America, this symbol was also used, except that it was always grayscale, and you couldn't tell the colors apart. Similarly, when it came to the controller design, the North American colors use a lavender and purple design as opposed to the multicolored buttons of the Super Famicom. Another major difference is the Y and X buttons on the Super Nintendo controller are concave as opposed to convex, which are all the 4 face buttons. This sort of makes the Y button a better trigger and feels a little bit better than the Y button on the Super Famicom, except that the difference is very, very negligible, and it's really just personal preference. Both controllers can be used on either hardware, so you can use a Super Famicom controller if you want on a Super Nintendo, or you can use a Super Nintendo controller on a Super Famicom. Alright, so now I'm going to get into 10 games that I recommend newcomers to the system pick up. Now again, these are not necessarily the best games on the system. They are just games that I would recommend, people that are new to the system and, want to explore the library and, don't really want to destroy their wallet should check out. So here we go. First of all, Super Mario World, which was Super Mario Bros. 4. This is one of the best games of all time, and it's a no-brainer. Super Mario game on a Super Nintendo platform, of course. Pilot Wings. Pilot Wings was an early example of the Mode 7 sprite scaling capabilities of the Super Nintendo to render sort of pseudo 3D environments. It's a really fun game, really good tech demo of what the Super Nintendo can do, and it's available, and these games are also available on both platforms. I'm just showing off the North American versions. SimCity. SimCity was another early Super Nintendo title that exemplified what the system was capable of doing to bring the popular PC game to home consoles. SimCity is one of the greatest creation games of all time. Will Wright was brilliant game. Awesome. Super R-Type. Spaceship shooters were very common on the Sega Genesis, but not so popular on the Super Nintendo. This one wasn't on the Sega Genesis, and it's completely awesome. It's one of the best shooters of the generation. Now, depending on your preference, I'll either recommend one or either of or both of these games. They are Super Mario Kart or F-Zero. Super Mario Kart and F-Zero are pretty much the different faces of the same coin. F-Zero is single-player focused, but focuses on speed, whereas Super Mario Kart is much slower, but focuses on multiplayer. And so it depends on what kind of game you're looking for. If you're looking for a single-player focused game, or you're looking for a multiplayer focused game. If you can, pick up both of them because they're both fantastic games. But I'll put them in as ties. Next. Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Of course, Legend of Zelda, always awesome. Zelda 3 is one of the best Zelda games of all time, and of course there's a new 3DS sequel to it, so Zelda 3, Link to the Past. Alright. Now, Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country is one of the most beautiful games for the Super Nintendo. Great soundtrack, amazing game. Mega Man X. Mega Man X is just... oh man, just watch Eagle Raptor's thing. Awesome. Super Metroid, and lastly, Star Fox.